Yes, good morning. It's Tuesday, the 28th of July, 2020. Welcome back to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. I'm your host, Pete Fairbairn, and as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top sports journalists to talk you through five of the biggest yarns making waves in the world of sport this morning. Adam Pengilly from the Sydney Morning Herald's with me from Sydney. How are you, mate?
Morning, Pete. Very gloomy and dark down here in Sydney today. Belting down rain, but we're getting closer to August. That means September and then October. Footy finals around the corner.
Footy finals and spring racing, which is something I know will also have you up and about. And we are going to talk plenty of football and a little bit of racing on the show today. So that's a nice segue to move straight into it if you're ready to go.
Yep, ready to go. Let's do it.
Fantastic, mate. We're going to start our story or our agenda today down in Melbourne in the Herald Sun with a piece from John Ralph, who interviews former Hawthorn and Melbourne ruckman Jack Fitzpatrick. This is all in the context of the top 100 rich lists, which have been published across News Corp newspapers over the last 2 to 3 days, basically breaking down the top 100 paid athletes in both the AFL and the NRL, and then some really interesting stories into salaries, into money in the game, the amount of money that players have sacrificed during COVID. They've looked at back-ended deals and how they've been impacted, but it's been a pretty fascinating series and relatively unprecedented here in Australian media. This particular story, Fitzpatrick talks about the amazing opportunity to suddenly be paid $80,000 a year as an 18, 19-year-old and be the best paid of all your mates, but also the flip side. And in his instance, just the 26 AFL games over 8 years and a lot of living contract to contract, year by year or maximum couple of years at a time around that $80,000 base mark was consistent for him throughout his footy journey. He talks about also that the flip side being that a lot of these players get delisted or aren't recontracted and they have to head off into the world without qualifications or without a trade behind them. I guess the purpose of the interview is to say, hey, look, not every professional athlete is driving around in a sports car and living their best life. It's a really interesting look from the other side of the fence. But Adam, I want to talk to you more broadly about these top 100 lists that we've seen published in the News Corp papers over the last few days. It's very commonplace in European football, and we know in US sports, players' salaries are common knowledge. Not so much the case here usually in Australia. Are you supportive and do you think the public has a right to know what their favourite footy players are being paid?
Yeah, firstly, Pete, how good would it be an 18-year-old earning $80,000 a year? That would have been nice back in the day. I couldn't do that pulling a few beers at uni. To answer your question, I'd probably believe a little bit opposite to what the general public would. I'd say yes. I would love to see more transparency around the salaries that some of our highest earning football stars get in terms of the salary cap area we've got in the AFL and the NRL. Now, I know there'll be an argument saying, well, they'll put it back on your Players Association saying, okay, as a journalist, would you like your wage being public knowledge? As a media manager, would you like your wage being public knowledge? Some people might say no to that. But I think in today's day and era, we have these salary caps and they're supposed to even up the competition. There's so much scuttlebutt and rumours about player payments that go around for our major football codes. Why not? We've seen American sports go down that model. You can go to and watch an American sport, turn up to a game, watch Andrew Bogut play centre for whoever he's playing for at the time, the Golden State Warriors, and say, I know how much this guy's earning for the season. He's not performing up to expectations. Let's bring someone else in. So my opinion is yes, I'd love to see more transparency around the salaries of our major football codes.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I think even I was reading during the coronavirus pandemic, kind of Sweden as a community or as a society. In Sweden, you can Google what your neighbour earns, regardless of their profession or occupation. And, it's definitely an interesting take and a different take. I can understand both sides of the coin there, but I have been fascinated to read the work by those News Corp journalists over the last few days. We're going to move from AFL into Rugby League, and it's the Indigenous Round. Already some fantastic initiatives. If you head to NRL.com in particular, I've seen some wonderful coverage there, and you can vote for your best Indigenous player of the last 20 years. But a good article from Alicia Newton at NRL.com looking into the return of Latrell Mitchell for the South Sydney Rabbitohs this week, just in time to provide that spark for Indigenous Round. Of course, Latrell being suspended for 2 weeks off the back of Cody Walker also being suspended for a couple of weeks earlier this year. And Alicia Newton's got some quotes from Walker, also from Adam Reynolds, about ill discipline at the Bunnies and about the impact that's had on their season so far. I think the 4 games that those 2 players have been suspended for have been 4 losses for the South Sydney Rabbitohs. Adam, they're currently sitting 10th on the table. Is their place on the ladder a true reflection of where they are right now, or is that a result of the kind of circumstances around suspension and injury for key players?
Absolutely, Pete. I think it's a true reflection of just where they are. Like, firstly, South desperately need Latrell to be back in the mix this week. Him missing the last 2 games has hurt them enormously. They need that spark back at fullback. But going into this season, I thought South, again, were a legitimate top 4 team. I know they'd lost a couple of their big guns in Sam Burgess, John Sutton, their forward leaders. But I still thought their pack, if they could do a good enough job, their backline was going to win them so many games. It just hasn't turned out that way, Pete. I think they are genuinely just a mid-table team at the moment. I know some people will say, their position at 10th, as you mentioned earlier, doesn't reflect what type of team they potentially are. And I can agree to that to an extent. But the way they've played this year, they don't deserve to be in the top 8. Let's be honest. I think Wayne Bennett's got a lot of work to do at South Sydney and Redfern in the next 9 weeks of the year. And them not making the finals this year would be a complete failure. You can't sugarcoat it any other way. They should be a finals team every day of the week this year. And it looks like it's going to be a stretch for them to make it. I think they've got a reasonable draw in the last 9 weeks, but they need to start winning some games soon to ensure they're going to be in the top 8 at the end of the season.
And, of course, coming up against the Dragons team, who were pretty stiff on the weekend, that well-publicised bunker decision in their narrow loss to the Cronulla Sharks. The Dragons, they need a win as well to stay in the finals hunt. So do you think it's a case of whoever goes down in this clash is probably unlikely to be playing in the postseason?
Well, St. George, if the Dragons lose, Pete, they won't make the finals. I doubt they can make the finals even as it currently stands if they win on Thursday night. That result on the weekend was crucial to their season. I don't want to put it all on the bunker. I think they had other chances to win that game. They didn't win it. For the Dragons, they just have to win on Thursday night. I think South can probably still afford to lose on Thursday night and make the finals, and it makes their job a hell of a lot harder. So they need to start stringing some wins together. They need to start winning on Thursday night. Staying
in rugby league, and it's a huge story. Phil Gould, one of the most decorated individuals in the 13-man code, looks like he's going to be getting a job with the governing body. ARL Commission Chairman Peter V'landys wants to give him a corner office so he can do a complete review of the problem area of match officials. He's also likely to look at the way that the game is developing in Pacific nations, in New Zealand, and in general, a bit of a health of the game role. Gould essentially confirming on 100% Footy last night on the Nine Network that, yes, he is going to take on the role. That's, of course, alongside his existing role as a Nine media performer, whether it be television or also the column he writes in the Sydney Morning Herald every Sunday. He's also talked recently about setting up his own player agency business. Andrew Webster with a really good yarn in your paper this morning, Adam, and I want to know from your perspective, do you think this would be a case of jobs for the boys if Phil Gould was given this position, or is this simply another illustration of Peter V'landys' ability to just get things done?
I think the lines are a little bit blurred here, Pete, to be honest. I can sort of see both arguments that you've just raised there. There is no doubt that Gus, if he was to take on some sort of consultancy role at the NRL, will make a difference. In particular to the pathways and development of the game. We've seen what he's done with Penrith over the last 7 or 8 years before he left there last year. And just look at the guys coming through their squad at the moment. They're leading the ladder at the moment, basically on the strength of their local juniors coming through the system. So yes, from an NRL point of view, if he gets his fingers and hands dirty with the pathways and development of the game, perfect, great. Match officials, this is where it gets a little bit grey, I think, a little bit of a grey area, because you can't be sitting there in the commentary box on a Thursday or Friday night or a Sunday afternoon, in my opinion, criticising officials if you're also working behind the scenes to try and fix it up. Now, to me, that represents a little bit of a conflict of interest, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. The player agent stuff, well, that was floated earlier this year that he was looking at getting into player agency and setting up his own business, and he still might be wanting to do that. There's no official confirmation that he's got his license yet. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work with the NRL as well. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't be on the payroll as a consultant doing stuff for the game, but also have to come under their rules and umbrella, which the NRL has tried to bring back under their authority in the last couple of years to look after player agents a lot more closely. I don't know how that's going to work. So I would say, yes, bringing me on a consultant point of view from working on pathways, development, working on grassroots rugby league. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work from match officials and player agent point of view.
And according to your colleague, Andrew Webster, the deadline, if he does want to register as a player agent, is this coming Friday. So you'd expect this will all come to a head in the next kind of 72 hours or so, that Gould will be presented with a formal offer by Peter V'landys, and also will have to make a decision if he does want to apply to be an NRL player agent. There's some pretty massive conflicts there, but at the same time, the amount of IP that somebody like Phil Gould could bring into head office there is fairly unrivaled within the game. Our penultimate story this morning, we turn to the Rugby Union Code and an article by Wayne Smith in The Australian. And he has a look at the plan B Rugby Australia has in place. They're unable to get a Trans-Tasman Super Rugby competition set up in partnership with New Zealand for 2021. Well, at least 2021 in isolation, if not onwards. Essentially, obviously, with the COVID pandemic has forced a complete reconsideration of the ability to include countries like South Africa, Argentina and Japan in the Super Rugby competition, and looking more likely we're going to see something a little bit more concentrated here in the Pacific. Australia are very keen to have 5 teams involved, including the return of the Western Force to any competition that Australian teams play in. New Zealand have basically said we want a competition between 8 and 10 teams max. 5 of them are going to be Kiwi teams and 1 of them is going to be a Pacifica team. So you're looking at anywhere between 2 and 4 Australian teams maximum being involved in the competition that we want to set up. It's been a fascinating one to watch play out. Rugby Australia, both the chairman, Hamish McLennan, but also the interim chief executive, Rob Clark, have been very strong in their communication that they want 5 teams and that if New Zealand doesn't want to have 5 Australian teams, Australia's happy to go out on their own and try some different things. From your perspective, I mean, I've been pretty close to this sport for a number of years, but from the outside looking in, have you been impressed with Rugby Australia's response to the attempted strong arming by New Zealand?
Yeah, Pete, as you said, you'd be a lot more across this story than me, but just watching from afar, absolutely. I see no reason why they shouldn't have their own domestic competition, at least for 1 year, if they can't come to some sort of agreement with New Zealand about a Trans-Tasman competition. Now, there'll be commercial considerations around this, Pete, what will be better from Australian rugby point of view in the future. Can I just talk about on-field point of view? Like, how is Australian rugby going to develop if we only have 2 or 3 teams in this Trans-Tasman competition? Is that better for the overall long-term health of the game, having only 2 or 3 teams playing against New Zealand teams? Or are they better served looking inwards and having a 5-team domestic competition? To me, I would sort of suggest maybe having a 5-team domestic competition might be a little bit better going forward to try and spread the depth of talent around the country rather than just sort of pulling all your best talent into 2 or 3 teams and heading across to New Zealand. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you think we should have a domestic competition here for five teams?
Well, look, I was going to make sure today's episode was a Joseph Suaalii free zone because we've talked about him, a fair bit over the last week, and there's a lot of public commentary on that young man, which frankly has probably got to the point of being a bit unfair for a young man like him to take on his shoulders. But let's look at an example like Joseph Suaalii. If we only had 2 or 3 Australian teams competing in a Trans-Tasman competition, that severely impacts the ability for rugby to compete with rugby league as a code and secure some of these talented youngsters, because there's just not going to be A, the money within the game, or B, the spots on the field to be able to expose some of these talented players to top class competition. I think what I would say, and there's some really well-respected people within the game who have different arguments all the way from 3 Australian teams being the best model to 5. I think regardless as to where you stand on the number of teams in the competition, what we're really pleased to see is Australian rugby standing up for itself and not being prepared to continue in what's been described by Hamish McLennan as a master-servant relationship with New Zealand rugby for so long. We know the All Blacks are a huge global brand. We know they've been incredibly successful on the field. You don't need to tell us how long it is since Australia has won the Bledisloe Cup. But the flip side of that is that from a commercial perspective, New Zealand rugby's maxed out. There's no more people in that country ready to be converted and become fans of the 15-person code. They've tapped out. It's the national sport. From a financial perspective, New Zealand rugby is absolutely bleeding money. Perhaps not in the same way Australian rugby has consistently for many years, but New Zealand rugby is not in a strong financial position at all. What we have in Australia is a potential growth market. We've got close to 7 times the population that New Zealand does. And if we could come up with a dynamic rugby competition, we genuinely have the possibility of growing the fan base, growing the audience, and getting new people in to watch the game. And I think that's the critical thing to keep in mind here. No matter how many teams are involved, no matter whether it's a Trans-Tasman competition, a domestic competition, a Trans-Pacific competition, we need to find ways to expand the rugby follower base and get new people watching the game. Personally, I think the only way that we can do that is by standing up to New Zealand rugby and making sure that we call the shots in what's the best interest for Australian rugby.
Perfect. You said it all.
You happy to take that? There we go. We'll move to our final story here. Now, this is one that I don't know where you watched the race from, and I'm interested to hear. But race 1 at Rose Hill on Saturday, there was an awful incident which saw jockey Andrew Adkins come off his horse, hot and hazy. Hot and hazy, unfortunately, had to be euthanised, but it was quite a horrific clash to start the day's racing at Rose Hill. Certainly one that caught me pretty unawares and by surprise. And we've got a situation now where there's a steward's inquiry into what happened in that race. Andrew Adkins in hospital, seriously injured, won't be able to race for a long time. There's a steward's inquiry on hold into what eventuated, essentially until Adkins is able to give evidence and talk through what happened from his perspective. From the outside looking in, with certainly a less educated racing mind, I should say, than yourself, Adam, it looked like champion jockey Hugh Bowman was potentially at fault. His horse ended up going on to win the race, and it was his horse which made contact with Adkins and his mount. So I want to ask, from somebody who works really closely in this space, if you could give us some insight as to when we're likely to see that steward's inquiry completed, and if Hugh Bowman were to be charged with reckless riding as opposed to careless riding, what are the potential punishments for that type of charge if found guilty?
Yeah, firstly on the steward's inquiry, Pete, I think Racing New South Wales stewards had hoped to at some stage have that inquiry continued a little bit later this week. I doubt that's going to happen given the seriousness of Andrew's injuries. He's still in Westmead Hospital in a high dependency unit. He's expected to be there for another few days. So I don't think he's going to be able to give evidence at any stage this week. It's probably more likely if things go okay next week. So that's when the inquiry will resume. On the case of Hugh Bowman, I watched the race like you from home. I was watching my phone. I was stunned when I saw it happen. We've only seen the lateral shot, or a lot of people have only seen the lateral shot so far of the race on race day, and you can't sugarcoat it, Pete. It didn't look good for Hugh. It looked like he tried to shoulder his way through a gap that potentially wasn't there. What I will say is that when stewards do these inquiries, they look at multiple camera angles. It's like the bunker, as you see in rugby league, the TMO in rugby union. They use various camera angles before deciding a decision. So stewards will use the lateral camera angle, they'll use a front-on camera angle, a behind camera angle, sort of an overhead to the side sort of camera angle. They use many different angles to come up with a decision. What most people saw on the weekend was just one camera angle, was just a lateral shot. I would say that to get the full picture, they probably need to see a front on or a behind camera shot. Now, to the point of what, if Hugh Bowman is found guilty, and we can't sugarcoat it, it didn't look well, stewards can either charge him with careless riding or reckless or improper riding if they think it's a far more serious transgression. Careless riding, he'll be looking at a decent suspension, I would have thought, if he's found guilty. Reckless or improper is when the suspension gets really severe. It could potentially be months. But they need to make that decision. If they think he's done that and they want to throw the book at him, go for it. That's their decision. But until that steward's inquiry happens, it's probably going to be a little bit difficult to ascertain what the result's going to be. The one thing I'll just quickly say on Hugh Bowman is that I've known Hugh for a fairly long time now. It was his first ride back in over a month. He had a short little break, had a hernia operation. There's no way you can tell me that he went out there intentionally trying to hurt someone or doing dangerous actions. It's just not in his makeup. He's ridden in thousands and thousands of races over the years. He's had to make so many split-second decisions in all those races, and 99.9% of the time, he gets them right. If he's got this one wrong, well, then he'll pay the penalty, obviously, but it's just not in his DNA to ride like that. So as much as we're all feeling for Andrew Adkins and his family, he's had horrible luck as a rider the last couple of years with injuries. Let's just spare a thought for Huey as well, because I think he went home on Saturday night feeling pretty low about himself.
Very well said, Adam. That really speaks to the heart of this show and why we like to bring in the top journalists in the country who have those relationships, who have that insight into the personalities behind the headlines. And as you say, our thoughts are with Andrew Adkins, but absolutely, I dare say it's not sitting all that well with Hugh Bowman as well, and potentially massive ramifications for the Spring Carnival if he were to miss any of those key races. We'll keep an eye on when that one may play out, and I dare say you'll be covering a lot of that for the Sydney Morning Herald. Adam, before I let you go, what's your one to watch in the world of sport today?
What's going on today? Is there an AFL game on tonight or something, or A-League? I can't keep up, Pete, with how much is going on. That's a very good question. I don't know. What is the one to watch today?
Well, there's no AFL tonight, but it is maybe that's the one to watch. What's on Channel 7 tonight and how they're going to get through before now having 33 games in 20 days. And maybe it's for AFL fans amongst us, maybe it's the last night you can sit down for a nice family meal without having to worry about keeping an eye on the footy in the corner. What do you reckon?
Yeah, watch these rugby league teams named this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Team list Tuesday, in particular the Raiders. They've got a couple of guys who've refused to take the flu vaccine. They're making their first trip to Queensland this week to take on the Cowboys. Very interested to see if Josh Papali and Joe Tarpany are named in their 21-man lineups this afternoon.
There you go. Yeah, nice, mate. Very good indeed. Thanks so much, Adam Pengilly, for joining me this morning. Look forward to having you back on the show again soon.
Thanks, Pete.